Hello everybody. Happy Friday. Welcome to our final virtual seminar of the year. We are very, very happy to feature another MSEM alumni, also a meteorology alumni of Millersville, Amber Liggett. So first, a little bit about Amber. Amber Liggett obtained her bachelor's in meteorology and master's in emergency management from Millersville University of Pennsylvania. She strives to work in both fields throughout her career. Formerly, Amber was concurrently the Pennsylvania Department of Health Public Information Officer, working in public health emergency preparedness and response communications, and a freelance broadcast meteorologist at the Harrisburg, PA, ABC affiliate. Currently, Amber is a communications analyst for CollaborLink Technologies, Inc., working as a federal contractor at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, Office of Oceanic and Atmospheric Research Climate Program Office. She is also a science writer and a public speaker for weather, climate, and emergency preparedness and disaster sciences. So without further ado, Amber, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Brian. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. And start the slideshow. Are you able to see? Okay, are you able to see it?
Yep, we're good.
All right, cool, sounds great. So thanks for having me. Again, my name is Amber Liggett, and today I want to talk with you all about how to manage environmental hazards. So the first thing that we'll go ahead and do just to kick things off is using Mentimeter. If you go to menti.com and then you type in the code 56808653, the first question is, what comes to mind when you hear the word environment? So I'm gonna go over to Mentimeter and see what people are saying. So this should populate as people get to it. So again, it's Menti, menti.com, and then the code is 56808653. So we'll give it just a moment. So we have surroundings, seasons, pollution, greenery, Earth Day, air, plants. Yeah, lots of variety here when we think about environment. Our world, seasons, wildlife. Yeah, no, this is great. And really just wanted to ask that broad question because environment is very broad. And today is also Earth Day. So I wanted to first say happy Earth Day to everyone. And providing here a Native American proverb. It says, we do not inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children. And just a little bit more background information about Earth Day. It actually started in 1970. So we are 52 years into Earth Day. And actually the first year that it started in 1970, the first Earth Day led to the creation of the EPA, which is the Environmental Protection Agency, and the passage of other first of their kind environmental laws. So that included the National Environmental Education Act, the Occupational Safety and Health Act, and the Clean Air Act. And now today with Earth Day, it's widely recognized as a day that we celebrate actions of change for human behavior in creating global, national, and local environmental policy changes. And there's also a website that I would encourage you to go to learn more about Earth Day, about the history and how you can get involved with things around the year for celebrating Earth Day and working to do this environmental change. You go to earthday.org. And I think the theme this year is invest in our planet. So you can learn a lot more at that website. Again, it's earthday.org. So just moving into the rest of the discussion today, I'll go a little bit more in detail of my journey, and then we'll go into an overview of environmental hazards and focusing more on climate and weather related events and hazards, and talking about how we can manage these events before, during, and after, and looking at the steps to resiliency, which is a framework developed by the United States Climate Resilience Toolkit as a way to manage these. And then we'll do a recap and Q&A. So again, my journey, I started at Millersville in 2014 with the meteorology major, and then I added on a mathematics minor. And it was about my junior year, after doing several internships, that I determined I really wanted to focus in on the communication aspects. And so within that, I learned a lot more about the MSCM program and talked to Dr. Yalda about it, and decided I was going to go ahead and apply for the master's program. And I also applied to be a graduate assistant within the Center for Disaster Research and Education. And so I was able to do that while I was getting my master's as well. And then similarly, that same year that I started my master's program, which was 2018, that is also the fall where I started freelancing at ABC 27. And so again, if you're not from Pennsylvania, it's South Central Pennsylvania television market. And so I did that for 3 years through December of 2021. And so that was throughout the time that I was in grad school, and then continuing on, because I do really enjoy being able to talk about weather and emergency management and the importance of both of those fields. But the first job I had coming out of my master's program was working at the Department of Health here in Pennsylvania. And what was interesting about the public information officer role there is that it fell under both the Bureau for Emergency Preparedness and Response and the Office of Communication. And so with COVID ongoing, I got to do a lot of work in public relations and learning a lot about how to do press releases, plan and staff press conferences, writing other talking points, and being a liaison to healthcare professionals. And then on the emergency management side of things, helping to write communication plans that were related to COVID-19 or other infectious diseases, updating those kinds of crisis and emergency risk communication plans. And so I held that role up through the beginning of February of this year. And that is when I started at Collaborating Technologies, which is a federal contracting company. And so I work at NOAA, which is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And within there, I'm in the Climate Program Office. So as a communication analyst there, I work on internal communications, which really means to promote different types of climate research that's either coming out of the Climate Program Office or being funded by the Climate Program Office. And really the importance of this role is, really helping NOAA leadership and people on the Hill and in Congress understand what is the new climate research coming and why they should care about it, why they should keep funding it. And there's a variety of audiences that we serve. And so while I focus in on those audiences on the internal side, we have members of our team, which is our communication, education, and engagement team. We have some members of the team that work more on the public facing side. So if you're familiar or ever heard of climate.gov, it is a online publication, and you can take a look at the website. There's different articles that really speak to people who have an interest in climate or want to learn more about climate. So we can really engage with people that way, or through the social media platforms on NOAA Climate. There's a lot of engagement there. And then the United States Climate Resilience Toolkit, which we're going to go into a little bit more detail about in this discussion, is another way that we reach different audiences like emergency managers and other decision makers. So when we talk about environment, the CDC, so Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, they really describe environment as the air that we breathe, the water that we drink, the food that we eat, and the places that we live, work, and play. And they break down environmental hazards. Again, it's a very broad topic, so breaking it down into different categories from air contaminants, toxic waste, radiation, disease-causing microorganisms, pesticides, heavy metals, chemicals in consumer products, and extreme weather and climate events. And so I do encourage you to take a look at all of these different types of environmental hazards, but I'm going to focus in on the weather and climate events just because that's where my background is, and I can speak to that part a little bit better. So climate hazards really are long-term hazards. So when we talk about the average of weather over a period of months or years, that's what we're talking about when we think of climate. So different hazards can vary from heat and cold waves to drought, changes in ice coverage, sea level rise, changes in water temperature, urban heat islands, which really, when we look at a city and urban areas and look at the fact that lots of temperature changes and really the amount of heat that gets confined in those areas is a lot higher in these urban settings, even up to about 20 degrees warmer. That's speaking to the urban heat island effect, and that is exacerbated by climate change and increasing precipitation or increased frequency and intensity of extreme weather events. Those are all climate hazards. And then the shorter time scales, what we're used to seeing on a day-to-day basis, whether it's a severe thunderstorm and lightning, all the way to hurricanes, tornadoes, wildfires, flooding, winter storms, or any other kind of weather hazards that you can think of. That is what we're talking about, that day-to-day weather time scale. And there's a lot of work, and especially within Millersville and the CDRE, there's been a lot of work on talking about preparedness and how to manage all types of hazards and disasters before they occur. And while the focus for the beforehand has been on education and outreach and preparedness, there is actually a lot more that we can be doing afterwards. So I'm not going to focus as much on the beforehand, but just wanted to acknowledge that these are some of the ways that we've been able to successfully reach people, educating them on what their different hazards are, seeing if they've been able to utilize messaging from emergency managers or other city managers and decision makers, and how well they understand that. Are they prepared? Do they have their safety kits together? That sort of thing. So there's a lot of outreach that happens on that front, but focusing in on the after. And the during, you'll see as we go through this presentation, the during really does depend on that before and after part. But when we talk about how to manage these events after they've already happened, we can hone in on resiliency, which is building back better, but also talking about how to adapt to the impacts that have already occurred from a disaster, and then what strategies can be used to mitigate future impacts. So it's kind of a loop, one of those strategies is resiliency. So that's what we're going to focus in on today. And just wanted to show you this graph here, looking at two different graphs, levels of resilience. So let's take a company, for example, and that's what we're going to see here. Business as usual, but then the service drops once a hazard occurs, a tipping point where, now they're really at a loss. But they start to recover, but without more resilient efforts, they have permanent loss. Whereas taking time and money and resources to invest in becoming more resilient, and we're going to go into what that actually looks like, taking time to do that beforehand, when we have, that drop of service, once a hazard occurs, you don't actually hit the tipping point to the point where it's unrecoverable. And you actually do recover to a point where you're above business as usual and you are more resilient. And so what does that really mean? Well, we're going to go into the 5 steps to resilience. We're going to watch a series of videos that really break down each of these steps. So the first is exploring hazards. The second is assessing vulnerability and risk. The third, investigate options. The fourth is to prioritize and plan. And the fifth is to take action. And I will give a preface that this is focused on climate-related hazards, but it's applicable to weather and other environmental hazards as well. So go ahead and click on this first video, give it a moment to load. And again, this is the overview video.
The steps to resilience allow you to address climate stressors within a comprehensive planning framework. Why should you care about climate resilience? More extreme events mean greater risks. Community leaders are stepping up and seeking help to build resilience to climate-related hazards. Resilience is the capacity of a system to retain essential functions before, during, and after a hazard strikes. Think of your community or business. You produce or provide something, which we represent with this dotted line. This is business as usual. When a hazard strikes, things might get disrupted, but you also might recover over time. But what if the disaster is severe? You might cross a tipping point and not be able to recover completely. Whether you've experienced the loss or anticipate one, the smart response is to increase capacity so that the next time a hazard occurs, you won't suffer irreparable harm. That's building resilience. A resilient system can bounce back completely. Here's the sequence that successful projects follow. Explore hazards, assess vulnerability and risk, investigate options, prioritize and plan, and finally, take action. Whether you're doing all the work yourself or hiring experts, the steps to resilience keep you on track as you move from problem to solution. Ready to dive in?
Okay, so that is the overview. And when we look at the very first step, which is again exploring hazards, you want to consider the things that your community cares about and determine which ones are exposed to harm from these weather or climate related hazards. So we'll go into this next video.
Most climate resilience projects begin with a single person, a champion, who's committed to seeing a project through. But big decisions usually require teams. Give people roles appropriate to their responsibilities or the resources that they manage. These people are in the best position to understand impacts experienced in the past or that are likely in the future. Working together, assemble a complete inventory of who and what you care about protecting. Once you understand both hazards and the assets or people that are threatened, your team can use the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit to investigate climate stressors where you live. Our Climate Explorer reveals historical and potential future climate conditions for every county in the contiguous United States. Mapping technologies and federal data help in assessing exposure to hazards. But you'll balance these data with insights and judgment of your own, including the impacts to your community if an event does occur. Does climate influence hazards to people or assets that you value? If so, you have a climate resilience problem to solve and can move on to assessing vulnerability and risks.
Okay, so that is step one. And in a recap to this step, one of the things that you want to do is take a look at what are different weather and climate related hazards that have been impacting your region, historically speaking, because that'll help you determine what could impact it in the future. That's the
Amber,
first step.
your voice went quiet again.
Oh, it might be because of the video.
Yeah, it must be something with the video.
Okay. Can you hear me louder now?
A little bit.
Okay. Well, I'll just talk a little bit louder and then you can let me know when it's normal again. But what I was saying is after this step, a good recap is to take a look at different weather and climate related hazards that have been impacting your region historically, because thinking in the past is going to help to determine what could be impacting that area in the future. And so these are a list of different hazards that the Climate Resilience Toolkit shows. And then from there, you can take a look at different assets. And these are exposed assets that really could be impacted or damaged by these hazards and pair them together. So for example, residents in extreme heat, roadways, and flooding. So that's really the key with step one, is to figure out what are these different hazards and how the assets could be impacted in your community. We'll watch the video for step two. And this is focusing in on assessing your vulnerability and risks.
Assessing vulnerability and risk may be the most complex step in building resilience. If people or assets are in floodplains, overwash zones, fire-prone regions, or any area where climate-related hazards may strike, then those assets are exposed. Every asset has its own sensitivity based on its inherent capacity to withstand a shock. Adaptive capacity includes everything that can help in coping with change. All of these concepts are essential for assessing vulnerability. To move from vulnerability to risk, you'll need information about the probability of a climate-related hazard. In the past, long-term climate records and monitoring sufficed, but climate change increases the likelihood of many climate-related events. In addition to probability, risk incorporates the magnitude of an impact's consequence. The highest risks occur where both probability and the magnitude of the consequence are high. These are complex ideas. You may find it helpful to recruit expertise for your own vulnerability and risk scoping. Can you accept the risk that climate presents to your assets? If not, move on to investigating options.
All right, so that is what we're working with for step 2. And when we take a look at the recap here, I just put that graphic up here blankly because when you take a look at the website, which I'll be giving you the link to that later on here, when you take a look at that, that's where you can determine now these different assets and hazards that you've identified. You can go ahead and look, on the x-axis here, magnitude of consequence, on the y-axis, probability. And so again, if you are ranking high probability and high magnitude of consequence for impact, you know that that is a major risk for your community. So this is a good step for you to really see, what are you most vulnerable towards and what are your risks. Step 3 is to investigate options.
If you're beginning to investigate options, you should already have a good understanding of the greatest risks that you face. Designing and implementing your resilience project at this stage can be simplified by learning from others. Why invent something if someone else has done the research and development for you? The U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit includes more than 100 case studies that can help you benchmark your work relative to others. Whether you use our toolkit or another resource, list out the options for addressing each of your risks. There are generally 2 kinds of actions you can pursue: reducing exposure or increasing adaptive capacity. To reduce exposure, you might move assets or redesign landscape features to accommodate hazards on site. The goal is to keep people and property out of harm's way. Increasing adaptive capacity can encompass immediate responses or long-term planning. If emergency managers know what to expect, they can improve their response and recovery operations. If planners have a long lead time, they can design and build capital improvements. Your team will look for ways to combine options into an efficient set of choices that simultaneously address many priorities. Now, do you have a list of actions that stakeholders are willing to support? If so, move on to prioritize and plan.
Okay, so now you've made it through step 3, and what you'll notice is when we talk about investigating your options, the first step there is considering possible solutions for your highest risks, and then do some brainstorming. Check out how other communities have responded to similar issues as a guide to help build your list of potential options, and then having discussions with people in your community to reduce your list to the actions that are most feasible. And by the end of this step, you have your list of solutions ready that your community is willing to support. So all of these steps, as we're going through them quickly, just giving you an overview of them. But again, this is a great framework for you to think about with your organization or your community if you're looking at these kind of hazards. And as we move into step 4, prioritizing and planning, this is where you have the ability to evaluate your costs, your benefits, and your team's capacity to actually implement the solutions that you've identified. So we'll go into this video.
Now that you've got a list of options, you can firm up details about your priorities and your plan. Determine which of the risks you identified previously must be addressed. Be sure that essential neighborhoods, services, or other assets will remain intact following the hazards you anticipate you'll face. What are your team's criteria for success? Use a checklist to distinguish which options do and don't measure up. Now is the time to weigh costs and risk. The cost of doing 2 or more projects simultaneously may be substantially less than undertaking them independently. In the short term, you may need to address acute problems, but the actions you take today should leave options open for additional adaptation in the future. Do you have a sequence of actions that will protect people and assets that you value? If so, move on to taking action.
Okay. So for the recap for step 4, you want to, again, evaluate your costs, your benefits, and your team's capacity to implement the solutions. And then rank expected value of each action and integrate the highest value action into a step-by-step plan. This helps to develop a comprehensive plan where you can implement your favorite solutions as funds become available. And I think that's something important to highlight is within emergency management, we're used to doing a lot of planning, pre-planning, post-planning, and we know how important funds are with grants and whatnot. So this step really speaks to that. And lastly is taking action. So this is where you're able to actually implement the plan. You've gone through all of your steps, and now we'll just watch what happens when you are able to implement your plan.
Obviously, someone's going to have to do the work, and someone's going to have to pay for it. Anyone who has either responsibility or resources for making your project successful should be at the table when it's time to implement your plan. Confirm that your team includes this complete set of stakeholders.
With these billion-dollar projects, it's extremely important, unless you want to go back and do it over again, to design the project correctly for the climate variables that you're going to face in the future.
In addition to making capital improvements or implementing new work processes, it's important to monitor progress so you can gauge whether or not you've been successful.
We came through the 2013 flood with no structural damage to buildings. That's a phenomenal accomplishment given that it was a 50-year event.
By reviewing and reporting on your progress, you'll be able to refine your adaptation project, but you'll also help other people succeed.
We had to apply the very latest technologies to develop 30 years of hourly weather information. Certainly a model that's worked here in Southern California that we see expanding across the rest of the country.
Keep at it. Share your story with others. Building resilience will prove worth the effort when the next drought, storm, flood, or other climate-related hazard comes around.
Great. So you've made it through the 5 steps. Congratulations. The recap for 5 steps, for the 5th step, I should say, is again to secure your funds and begin implementing the first task of your plan. So basically going through your entire plan step by step. And as you complete each task, check to see if your actions are producing the result you expected, and then continue to monitor, review, and report on your project. And this does fit in with the emergency management structure, especially after a disaster happens, talking about an after action report and just evaluating the work that you've done. So this framework, the 5 steps to resilience, really does speak to emergency managers and other decision makers who are working to reduce their impacts to different hazards. And so as a recap for the entire project of managing environmental hazards, the before, during, and after do go together. As I said, with the before, talking about education and outreach as a mechanism to develop higher preparedness in your community, and knowing that that level of preparedness that you have impacts the level of response that you'll have. And afterwards, building back a more resilient community, adapting to changes that you may have had from past disasters, and then mitigating the impacts and having a strategy to mitigate against future hazards. So the big loop coming back together where all of these pieces before, during, and after managing environmental hazards all go together. So I told you I was going to show you the site. So the climate, it's the toolkit.climate.gov, but I'm going to just exit here and say that we'll go to the US Climate Resilience Toolkit. So just starting at the top of the page here. So again, the link is toolkit.climate.gov. It takes you to the Climate Resilience Toolkit. You'll see at the top here, you can pretty much touch on all of the different aspects of it, but I'll just scroll down. So what you'll see first is some featured information, and you'll have the ability to tour the toolkit, where you go through the steps of resilience, which we just went through. So you'll see that's towards the top of the page. Then you can see different case studies. These are case studies of people across the country and how they're building resilience in their communities, through their companies. So you can feel free to, scroll through all of those locations. There's also tools that include climate data and helping with climate planning. You can break down this information looking at it with different regions across the country. And there's also a section here for the Caribbean. There's different resources here. You can find climate science experts. You can look through different reports. There's training courses, and there's also a resource of state climate summaries. It breaks down resilience for different topics, from environment and ecosystems to food, transportation, even tribal nations. And then lastly, there is the Climate Explorer. So this is an interactive graph and comparison time series of maps. And there's an introductory version where you can basically get walked through this step by step so you can understand how to use this resource. And then there's a more advanced version where you can just launch the full Climate Explorer. So again, this is a toolkit worth of different materials and resources related to weather and climate related events. I'd encourage you to take a look at that. And as we go through the rest of the slideshow, next we want to go back to Mentimeter, and it's the same code. It should be the second question that pops up now. What is the correct order of the steps to resilience? So everything we just went through, this is a quick quiz to see if you have the correct order. So we'll go ahead and see what people put. These are the options, and they'll show up if you are on your computer or on your phone. They'll show up, and then you basically kind of match them. You'll have a drop down and you can match it. Okay, there we go. Okay. So it looks like everybody is positive about exploring hazards. We have a lot there. As that being the first step, that is correct. Second step, assess vulnerability and risk. Third, investigate your options. Fourth, prioritize and plan. And fifth, take action. So it looks like as a whole, everyone did a great job. You got it there correctly. Well, let's see. I think people are still filling it out. And now we've swapped with prioritize and plan and investigate options. But so it is step 1, explore hazards. Step 2, assess vulnerability and risk. Step 3, investigate options. Step 4, prioritize and plan. And step 5, take action. So overall, good job. Great job understanding that. That is all I have, and I'm happy to take questions. This is my contact information. If there's any questions related to my career path or related to the steps to resilience or weather and climate hazards in general, I will stop sharing my screen here and take a look at the Q&A.
Well, thank you so much, Amber. That was great. If anybody has any questions, feel free to raise your hand or you can put them in the chat.
Okay, Adam, hey, it's nice to see you. So your question, what are some of the outreach initiatives for the Climate Toolkit or any other services that we work with? Yeah, that's a great question. So I personally am kind of assisting in work with the Climate Resilience Toolkit, but I know that one of the projects that our engagement coordinator is doing is he's been working with communities to put together climate adaptation plans. So he's working on one right now with the city of Chicago. And so that is something that they're talking about working with other communities doing, but the one in Chicago has been a good model. And I could find the link to some more information about that and send it to you. Okay, my mom asks, what is being done to educate and engage youth about climate change? So there's a lot about teaching climate. We actually have a section on our climate.gov site that is for teaching climate. So one of the things that's being done is there's traditional education happening in schools where we provide information, a kind of a framework for the type of climate information that should be taught in schools. If anyone's interested in adding that to their curriculum, they can have those resources. So that's more on the formal side. Then also doing just traditional outreach from the virtual standpoint, or going into classrooms or having different classes or community organizations come to the NOAA headquarters and learn about different weather and climate information happening. So for example, there's something called Science on a Sphere, where it's basically a sphere that allows you to show different climate information in a visual standpoint on the sphere. So it can show information that is across the globe. It could hone in on different areas and show changes happening. And Adam also is adding into the chat about a big push for climate information within the National Weather Service offices. I